It's the early morning of February 24th, 2022. The cold silence of the Ukrainian Sumy region is broken by the sound of hundreds of engines. The endless columns of Russian vehicles begin their seemingly unstoppable push across the Ukrainian border, following key highways. Their goal is not a diversion or capture of small villages, but a strike right into the heart of Ukraine, its capital, Kyiv. And the most elite part of the Russian invasion force is planning to reach it right through the Sumy region. The Sumy region seemed like an ideal route for such an attack, especially when considering several key factors. First of all, its geographic location and the comparatively low density of population and urban areas, which would seemingly allow the Russians to advance rapidly. The forces stationed along the Sumy border reflected an ideal combination for blitzkrieg-style operation, with mechanized infantry and tanks forming the core. The elements of the Russian 6th and 2nd Combined Arms armies, along with the most elite 1st Tank Army, were assigned to this sector with the expectation that their armored fist would prove unstoppable. Diving into history, exactly this army, headquartered in Dresden during the Cold War, was supposed to march through Western Europe first, in case of hostilities with NATO. Quite ironically, the modern version of the elite 1st Guards Tank Army was unable to get even through the Sumy region, so it remains uncertain whether the original Russian plan indeed was for the grouping to advance right into Kyiv or to pivot southwards at some point. It's worth noting that the Ukrainian command also made several significant miscalculations, which only didn't result in disaster due to the combination of factors: the resistance of civilians, the sheer skill of few defenders, and equally catastrophic Russian blunders. In the Sumy region, the Russians clearly achieved the element of surprise, as much of the Ukrainian military and political leadership expected the new phase of the conflict to begin in the eastern part of the country, while the Ukrainian Operational Command North, led by Major General Viktor Nikolyuk, managed to establish a defense in the neighboring Chernihiv region, with its only two available units, the 1st Tank and 58th Motorized Infantry Brigades. They had little to no forces to defend the Sumy region. The majority of Ukrainian regular army units arrived in Sumy after the start of the Russian blitzkrieg, effectively plugging the gaps in crumbling or non-existent defenses. However, this does not mean that Ukrainians lacked a plan. Some units, such as elements of the 58th Motorized Infantry Brigade, recognized that defending the border would expose troops to enemy artillery and put smaller defense garrisons directly against the full force of Russian armored columns. Instead, they dispersed and waited for the enemy's first move. Around 4 a.m. on February 24th, Russians make their first move, crossing into Sumy region with over 1,000 pieces of equipment. Specifically, they strike towards Okhtyrka from Lukashevka with forces of the 4th Guards Tank Division. Nicknamed Kantemirovskaya, this division is one of Russia's most elite tank units. In order to attack Sumy head-on, they break through the border in areas of Grabovska and Pokrovka with forces of the 47th Tank Division, as well as in Myropilya and Yunakivka with the elite 2nd Motor Rifle Division, nicknamed Tamanskaya, and 27th Motor Rifle Brigade. To the north, near Bachevsk, in the direction of Gluchiv, part of the 90th Tank Division advances with the support of the 55th, 30th, 21st and 15th Motor Rifle Brigades. The border guards are forced to retreat or are captured, unable to combat Russian columns, but the Ukrainian armed forces almost immediately get to work. 16th Motorized Battalion of the 58th Motorized Infantry Brigade, positioned in Gluchiv in an attempt to evacuate border guards, leaves the town but immediately faces Russians, who are moving along the E101 highway. After a brief search for each other in the darkness, one of the Ukrainian BMP-1s even gets to ram Russian BTR on the road. But a confused engagement ends with both Ukrainians retreating after losing 3 BMP-1s and 1 MTLB, and Russians choosing to continue march along the highway instead of pursuit after losing 4 BTR-82s. The MTLB was dispatched for medical evacuation, during which its driver, Mikhailo Nasolyony, is killed in action. Apparently, the key road was also defended by servicemen of the 138th Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade, as near the destroyed gas station, the senior sergeant of this unit, Andrei Ivashko, is killed. Both soldiers will be posthumously awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine. This is likely one of the first, if not the very first, direct engagement between Russian and Ukrainian armed forces in the course of the full-scale invasion. As Russians continue their fast advance straight along the highway, most of the elements of the 58th Motorized Infantry Brigade, with headquarters in Konotop, that were dispersed according to orders of Viktor Nikolyuk, commander of the Operational Command North, start deploying to assigned prior to war positions. The brigade essentially stretches across Sumy and Chernihiv regions, organizing mobile groups ideal for hit-and-run attacks on Russian convoys. The absence of the rigid defensive line, however, lets Russia continue the rapid advance. To the south, the multilateral attack towards Sumy picks up pace. The city, less than 40 kilometers from the border, is an early objective for Russian forces. In Sumy, the 150th and 155th battalions of the 117th Territorial Defense Brigade quickly mobilized, joined by elements of the Ukrainian 81st Air Mobile Brigade that swiftly arrive from Lebedin. As in many other Ukrainian cities, hundreds of volunteers line up to join territorial defense forces and protect their homeland as Russian missiles scream above the cities. However, the first problems emerge. Unlike in Kyiv and Chernihiv, news of the Russian columns crossing the border causes many city officials and law enforcement to flee Sumy. This creates short-lived but damaging chaos as Russian forces approach largely unopposed. Despite the turmoil, weapons are distributed to volunteers near the former military academy, now the headquarters of the city defense, and the Sumy Elevator Rescue Service, where the 15th Rifle Battalion forms from local volunteers. In the first hours of the invasion, up to 1,000 men joined Sumy's defense. This mix of battle-hardened soldiers from the 81st Air Mobile Brigade and lightly armed but highly motivated locals prepares to face some of Russia's most elite forces. Around 7 a.m., the Battle of Sumy begins. Russian forces breach checkpoints on the northeastern outskirts, and the columns flood the city streets. Surprisingly, the troops do not capture administrative buildings and mostly aim to drive through the city as fast as possible. In a few hours, another Russian column reaches the southern outskirts of Sumy. The city defenders, much like the Ukrainian forces across the whole region, disperse but occasionally enter skirmishes and set up first ambushes on Russian vehicles on the streets. By 4 p.m., active urban combat begins in the area of former military academy, as it has the highest concentration of Ukrainian forces. The absence of local government and the presence of both Russian and Ukrainian troops on the city streets creates a unique situation of complete confusion for everyone. Meanwhile, outside Sumy, Russian forces bypass the city, also prioritizing the rapid advance to Kyiv. Whether due to operational urgency or false reporting by Russian officers claiming Sumy is captured, the decision leaves the city largely in Ukrainian hands. Whatever the real reason for Russians passing through and around Sumy instead of establishing full control, city defenders did not disappear and are about to leverage the enemy's first blunder. In contrast, the battles for Ohtyrka, located just 60 kilometers to the south, unfold quite differently. Russian forces quickly advance to the strategic town in the southern part of the Sumy region. With its sizable population and key road junction, Ohtyrka is initially defended by the military engineers of the 91st Separate Support Regiment under the command of the Denis Dickey, the local 154th Territorial Defense Battalion, and elements of the 58th Motorized Infantry Brigade. Ukrainian command rapidly dispatches reinforcements from the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, recognizing the importance of this town. These forces race with Russians, who already drive through the city streets in large columns. Being one of the Ukraine's most experienced brigades, the 93rd arrives under challenging circumstances, not at full strength and with minimal reconnaissance due to rushed nature of its assembly in response to the attack. Meanwhile, the battle between Ohtyrka defenders and the Russian 96th Reconnaissance Brigade, as well as the 423rd Motor Rifle Regiment of the 4th Tank Division, erupts in the middle of the city. Along the central street, Ukrainians make a number of ambushes with grenade launchers, so in panic as some Russian forces turn southwards, while some continue to drive to the west. After brief but intense combat, defenders capture the first prisoners of war of the full-scale invasion, as well as first trophies, successfully repelling the attack. This marks the first small Russian defeat in the Sumy region, inflicted mostly by the Regiment of Combat Engineers rather than regular forces. While these losses deal more damage to the Russian morale and reputation than to the overall combat effectiveness, the battle clearly demonstrates that even the most elite units of the 1st Tank Army are not invincible. Nevertheless, Russians continue to be a major threat, as the 423rd Motor Rifle Regiment of the 4th Tank Division also enters the sizable town of Trostianets, cutting off Sumy from Ohtyrka. In the northern part of the Sumy region, Russian forces also have quite a success. Despite constant small skirmishes, they attack Glukhiv from the east, encircle it, and then move to the south, taking Burin. After that, Russian columns advance towards Konotop, along both the E101 highway and local roads, quickly encircling the city as well. Local resistance engages in urban combat with Russians, destroying quite a rare Sturm S anti-tank missile system. Similar to Sumy, Russians still transport some forces through Konotop, but prefer to blockade it rather than claim full control. However, as the toughest day in the Ukrainian history so far closes to an end, inside Sumy the battles brew again. Overnight, one of the Russian columns, heading to the Sumy airport, which was likely envisioned as a good place for logistical hub on the way to Kiev, gets ambushed by soldiers of the 81st Air Mobile Brigade and the Territorial Defense Forces. Once again, the combat is rather confusing as Ukrainian self-propelled howitzer appears on the street in front of the 4 Russian trucks. In the dark, Territorial Defense Forces as well as soldiers of the 81st Air Mobile Brigade destroy the column, fire from which lights up the city for the whole night. This engagement is particularly emblematic of chaos in the city, as the Ukrainian artillery column of the 81st Brigade happened to be right next to the Russian column during the ambush. Despite multiple vehicles being damaged, Ukrainians suffered losses of only 5 men, and 1 mortar truck was destroyed. Russians lost at least a few times more, as 2 of the trucks were filled with infantry, while the other 2 carried fuel. Despite this small victory, which undeniably raises defenders' morale, Russians concentrated hundreds of vehicles around Sumy, in the villages of Kosivshina, Tokary, and Verkhnya Serovodka. In the stark contrast with nearby Chernihiv region, where they took stationary positions around the key city, in the Sumy region they continued to push westwards, making it harder for scattered Ukrainian artillery to service targets. Thus, the situation remains rather critical. On the next day, February 25th, the Russian pace of advance drops, but it is simply due to the fact that troops already advanced quite far, literally crossing the whole Sumy region. Various Ukrainian forces, from small groups of dispersed regular army units to volunteers and members of the territorial defense, continue to ambush lone Russian vehicles, in an effort to further slow down the enemy's advance. To the north of Ohtyrka, the 91st Separate Support Regiment mines and blows up the bridge across Vorskla River, preventing Russians from launching new attacks from this direction. In response, Russians relentlessly shell Ohtyrka with MLRS. To prevent adversary from continuing their march to Kiev, elements of the 81st Air Mobile Brigade leave half-encircled Sumy and redeploy back to Lebedin, as it is the main town that stands in the way of the 4th Tank Division. While the real situation in Sumy is uncertain, border guards who initially retreated from the border, as well as elements of the National Guard, also decide to make their stand in Lebedin. All is due to the initiative of city mayor Alexander Baklikov, who, being an expert trooper himself, allowed the 81st Air Mobile Brigade to set up forward command post in the city a few days before the war. This critical decision allowed the elements of the brigade to assist Sumy defenders and now reinforce the southern part of the region. On February 26th, the Russian command, furious that their progress has slowed down, orders to conduct an airstrike on the military unit barracks and medical unit building in Ohtyrka. Both buildings are almost completely destroyed, with hundreds of soldiers buried underneath the rubble. The whole city population assists in the rescue mission to substitute the soldiers, who also have to continue defending the city perimeter. These strikes kill 90 Ukrainian soldiers, indicating that despite setbacks, the invading force is still able to inflict heavy casualties on Ukrainians due to their enormous advantage in aviation. A similar strike reaches the local fuel depot. Ukrainian aviation is concentrated to the west, busy defending the capital, so around Sumy, Russians pretty much achieve local air superiority, contested only by the quite abundant man pads. Russians almost encircle Sumy as they start moving forces along the H07 highway towards Robny, simultaneously linking up with friendly forces near Konotop. Despite active resistance from civilians, they push through Bakhmach, continuing to take losses in Konotop. The unusual encirclement here likely stems from the poor Russian intelligence. They expect that the 58th Motorized Infantry Brigade is still concentrated in its headquarters here, while in reality, prior to the invasion, it was widely dispersed across the region. Therefore, the Russian command wastes resources to encircle and block the city, which has no regular army units in it. Surprisingly, inside Sumy, the situation stabilizes after the first Russian column was burned down. The only Russian vehicle that enters the city is lone military maintenance truck. It is quickly spotted by two soldiers of the 15th Rifle Battalion, who travel in a cash truck and chase down the intruder. After a brief firefight, the Russians stop and after a short resistance surrender. The vehicle likely entered Sumy by mistake, but yet another destroyed Russian truck on the streets urges more civilians to join the resistance by demonstrating the simple idea. In most of the encounters, Russians quickly lose all their advantages if they get punched hard enough. Videos of numerous pieces of Russian equipment abandoned in near-perfect condition, as well as dozens of surrendered soldiers, further highlight the disarray among invading forces. This phenomenon fuels an increase in volunteer enlistment into defense forces, marking the emergence of the Sumy partisan movement. While every Ukrainian region under attack sees the formation of such units in some form, the activities of partisans in Sumy, as well as their impact on the war, are documented the most. As in the Chernihiv region, the overwhelming number of volunteers seek to join the local Territorial Defense Brigade leads to the creation of a separate unit, the 63rd Rifle Battalion. On their very first mission, the unit, composed of individuals who were civilians only days earlier, captures two Russian soldiers after spotting a BTR-82A that has aimlessly wandered in the city. Here, we will step back from the specific events to give a brief explanation of how Ukrainian territorial defense forces work. From the first glance, it may seem like upon invasion, Ukrainians just volunteer and form some kind of shady paramilitary organizations that roam around and occasionally do something. This couldn't be farther from the truth. Ironically, this is exactly how Russians saw it, and this is a part of the reason their initial invasion plans failed so catastrophically. In 2021, drawing from the experience of the war in Donbass and preparing for potential future conflicts, Ukraine reorganized its territorial defense battalions into a distinct branch of the Ukrainian armed forces, the Territorial Defense Forces, or TDF. Initially numbering 11,000 personnel, the TDF was structured into separate brigades, typically one per region, with a few exceptions. For instance, in the Sumy region, this was the 117th Territorial Defense Brigade. Each brigade comprised of separate battalions stationed in the major cities of the region. The 150th Battalion in Sumy, the 151st in Konotop, the 152nd in Romny, the 153rd in Shostka, the 154th in Ochtyrka, and the 155th in Stepanivka. The core of each battalion consisted of veterans from the war in Donbass, serving as part-time reservists. These veterans were tasked with training newly mobilized recruits and leading them into battle if necessary. Additionally, Ukraine introduced voluntary formations of territorial community, VFTCs, smaller units not officially part of the military. When a group of civilians from a specific locality volunteered for defense, they were automatically recognized as VFTC and placed under the command of the nearest Territorial Defense Battalion. This system allowed VFTCs to bolster the battalion without civilians having to navigate bureaucratic hurdles, especially crucial during surprise attacks. Furthermore, citizens could join the Territorial Defense Forces as official servicemen, or, if numbers allowed, form separate rifle battalions that could be subordinated to regular army brigades when needed. Highly decentralized, the Territorial Defense Brigades, composed of a network of battalions, reinforced by VFTCs, functioned as an invisible second army. While the TDF officially had just 11,000 personnel, it increased to over 100,000 within a week of Russia's full-scale invasion. This rapid expansion turned it into a formidable force, often operating behind Russian lines, as was often the case in the Sumy region. The decentralized nature of the TDF, relying heavily on civilian initiative and self-organization, proved invaluable. Officially activated on January 1, 2022, in response to the hostile Russian military exercises, the TDF had a critical lead time to quietly test the readiness of the Shadow Army, lightly armed but highly motivated and effective. Returning to the defense of Sumy, from February 26th, Russian forces continue their push, but vulnerabilities in their logistics begin to show. The rapid advance towards Rovny, coupled with attempts to establish stable crossing on the Psel River, southwest of Sumy, leads to mounting losses. Russians get as far as Vorozhba, but lack the forces and supplies to advance further. Meanwhile, Ukrainians solidify defenses in Ochtyrka and Lebedin, significantly restricting the 4th Tank Division's available routes for advance. The division, bogged down and failing to achieve its original goal of a swift breakthrough westward, brings forward the 275th Self-Propelled Artillery Regiment and initiates relentless shelling of the Ukrainian positions in nearby towns. Ochtyrka is bombarded the most, as Russian aviation continues to conduct airstrikes as well, destroying the 91st Regiment's storage for engineering vehicles, and a number of other infrastructure objects such as local thermal power plant, rail station, city hall, and numerous stores. During one of the artillery strikes, Inna Darusova, a combat medic of the 58th Motorized Infantry Brigade, who had saved over 10 lives in Ochtyrka, is killed while assisting the wounded. She became the first woman posthumously awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion. On February 27th, yet another lone BTR-82A enters Sumy. After the infantry on top is killed by city defenders, BTR tries to hide in the area of the train station. Next, just two workers of the rail system, Ruslan Aristarkhov and Artyom Kiselyov, capture lost Russian soldiers and transfer them to territorial defense forces. The BTR-82 belonged to the 27th Motor Rifle Brigade, likely intended as a reserve force. After the swift capture of Sumy failed, the brigade was redeployed for a direct assault on the city, a mission seemingly beyond its original scope. On its first day of combat against Sumy defenders, in addition to other vehicles, the brigade loses nearly half of the tank company, composed of brand new T-90As. Remarkably, two T-90As are evacuated by Ukrainian forces, as they were abandoned completely intact. In this unconventional manner, Ukraine becomes the proud 12th operator of this kind of Russian tank. A similar fate awaits the 1st Guards Tank Regiment of the 2nd Guards Motor Rifle Division. On February 27th, the column of the unit has managed to successfully bypass Sumy and even reach the outskirts of Priluki in the Chernihiv region. There, one of the most elite Russian tank regiments, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Denis Lapin, son of the infamous Alexander Lapin, author of the Siege of Chernihiv, clashes with around 50 locals and members of the 54th Reconnaissance Battalion. After losing multiple vehicles, being hammered by aviation, and simply disintegrating, the regiment is routed as far as southern outskirts of Sumy. Russian 1st Motor Rifle Regiment that advanced to the north of the 1st Tank is routed in a similar manner near Priluki as well. Out of the whole elite 2nd Motor Rifle Division, nicknamed Tamanskaya, only the 15th Motor Rifle Regiment gets some vehicles to the Kiev outskirts. To the south, Russians stubbornly try to move elements of the 26th Guards Tank as well as the 423rd Motor Rifle Regiments through Trostianets towards Lebedin and then Vyshkin, where they established river crossing. However, columns start disintegrating due to ambushes even before leaving the town, and little to no forces actually reach the destination. Moreover, around Lebedin, Russian forces are attacked by Bayraktar TB2 drones that curb all attempts to enter the city. The weak link here is likely the Russian 26th Tank Regiment. It belongs to the 47th Tank Division, which was created out of the 6th Tank Brigade right before the invasion. For some unknown reasons, however, Russians never properly expanded the unit. 47th Division literally operates under the 26th Tank Regiment and the 1077th Separate Logistics Battalion, which suffered heavy losses from Bayraktar TB2 drones, and whose current state can be best described by this photo. To avoid losing momentum, Russians switched to attempts to infiltrate between heavily defended Ochtyrka and Lebedin. In Chupahivka, they are ambushed as Ukrainian partisans destroy one and capture two intact tanks. The second ambush happens right on the river crossing and results in more losses as the Russian tank simply falls from the bridge into the river. Despite this, Russians still infiltrate as far as Vepryk, but at this point, under constant attacks of the 116th Territorial Defense Brigade that arrived from the nearby Poltava region, they are unable to cross Psel in force. Another reason for that is the lack of fuel, constantly delivering which to every scattered column becomes an impossible task. Moreover, the Russian command severely miscalculates the composition of columns. For example, in Vebryk, Ukrainians captured the Russian Tor M2 air defense system, as well as destroyed the Msta-S self-propelled howitzer. Most of these systems have a range of dozens of kilometers, and there is no way they were needed on the spearhead of the attack. On February 28th, emblematic of Russian logistical issues, Ukrainians discovered the whole Russian base in Chemodanivka, completely abandoned, with 7 intact command and control vehicles. It may seem like the invasion lasted just 4 days, and there are no reasons why Russians have to run out of resources. However, the 1st Tank Army, being likely the most elite part of the Russian military, so severely overestimated its own ability to advance that it pretty much had supplies for a day or two of active combat. Consequently, despite a number of victories on paper, the real situation for Russian troops begins to deteriorate to the point where a big fraction of forces simply gets lost or runs out of the fuel before reaching Kyiv. In this particular video, a Ukrainian civilian has a brief conversation with Russian soldiers that best sums up the whole situation.
Сломались, пацаны. Сломались.
Закончил соляр.
Можно оттащить на Россию обратно. А вы хоть знаете, куда вы едете?
Нет.
Куда?
Я нет.
На Киев, блин. Да.
А что по новостям говорят?
Ну, у вас пока все на нашей стороне. Ваши и плен сдаются хорошо. Потому что тоже пацаны не знают, куда ехать, блин. И я вот всю колонну пообспрашивал, таких как вы, никто не в курсе вообще, кто куда едет.
On March 1st, Russians apparently decided to overhaul their strategy, at least in the Sumy region. If before they prioritized speed of advance, particularly towards Kyiv, now Russian troops start to dig in and consolidate positions while continuing attempts to encircle Sumy. This is likely due to the fact that the Russian command planned to celebrate victory in Ukraine's capital at this point, but in reality they failed to take Sumy, Chernihiv, and most importantly Kyiv. Therefore, the strategy shift suggests Russians want to prepare for a number of sieges. In an attempt to finish Sumy's encirclement, they advance into Nizhny Surovatka village. However, heavy battles begin for the village of Nizy. Another Russian column moves from Vorozhba, composed of all the vehicles Russians accumulated after crossing the river near Byshkin. Ukrainians intercept and destroy it near Brovkove before it gets close to Sumy. The local partisans also ambushed a column that broke through the Nizy area, showing excellent coordination, especially for non-professional army unit. Some Russian vehicles also tried to enter the city from the south, as usual, in a disorganized and chaotic manner, but either get destroyed or retreat due to stiff resistance. Similar consolidation efforts happened in Trostianets, flooded with battered remains of the columns that tried to bypass Lebedin and survivors of failed river crossing attempts. Before the Russian columns simply passed through the town, but since March 1st, the Russian 4th Tank Division establishes its headquarters there, beginning the formal occupation. With this, the dark chapter in the city's history begins. Much like in the towns of the Kyiv outskirts, Russians loot all the city's stores and civilian buildings, occasionally murder and torture city residents, and in general cause a humanitarian catastrophe. At the same time, a big fraction of the 4th Tank Division troops stay in the forests around the town. On the next day, Russians tried to persevere Konotop residents, who ended up in complete encirclement from the first day of the invasion, to surrender the city. However, people who in mass take to the streets decline the proposal and choose to fight even after being blackmailed by city bombardment.
Вони нам поставили умови зараз. Якщо ми починаємо супротив, вони розносять місто артилерії. Якщо за, воюємо.
А что ты не хотел
Хто
вчера
за те,
палить?
щоб... Хто за те, щоб воювати? Воювати!
Конечно!
Хто за те, щоб воювати?
Конечно!
Почекай! Послухай, я за те, щоб воювати! Я за те, щоб воювати! Рішення, послухай! Рішення приймаємо всі разом, тому що артилерія на нас наведена.
Russians were clearly bluffing, as most of their forces were sent towards Kyiv, and those who were left to guard checkpoints around Konotop would not be able to meaningfully control the city with over 80,000 people or completely destroyed. This is how in fully encircled Konotop resists the occupation. On March 2nd, Russians continue heavy shelling of the city of Sumy and other small and large towns like Lebedin, Ochtyrka and Konotop. In Ochtyrka, the thermal power plant is completely destroyed, which severely degrades living conditions for the city residents, who have to survive in the freezing ruins of the city. Despite hardships, nobody even considers giving up the town to Russians. Overall, bombardments are mostly counterproductive, because after seeing indiscriminate strikes on residential buildings and infrastructure, even more people volunteer to join territorial defense forces. Many captured Russian vehicles, including tanks full of ammo, are brought to Sumy and regional centers with smaller roads that only locals know, so the garrisons of the besieged towns grow stronger every day. To the north of Sumy, where Russians clearly were the most successful, the Ukrainian territorial defense manages to block the border checkpoint by cutting down trees. It's not clear how effective this measure was, but it is a significant improvement compared to the first days, when the area was pretty much open door for Russians. However, the 15th, 21st, 30th, 55th Brigades, and even elements of the 90th Tank Division are already on the territory of Ukraine. The only thing that halts their advance is multiple ambushes of partisans in the southern Chernihiv region, which inflict enormous losses on columns before they arrive on Kyiv's outskirts. At the same time, the main Russian armored fist, the 1st Tank Army, is reliably stopped by Sumy region defenders and essentially sealed in the area of Trostyanets. On March 3rd, Russians further intensify bombardments, deploying an increasing number of artillery pieces around Sumy. Russian aviation also starts conducting airstrikes on the city. They again specifically target the energy, heating and water infrastructure, causing a humanitarian crisis and trying to sow panic. The same happens in many other villages in the region that are under Ukrainian control, as well as in Lebedin and Ochtyrka, which Russians also try to wipe out completely. By March 8th, the situation almost does not change. Russians, after a few more disorganized attempts to enter the city, back down. At the same time, they consolidate forces in places like Boromlya. From there, some attempts to advance on Sumy happen, but without much success. At the same time, Russia and Ukraine agreed to set up green corridors for civilians to leave the towns of Sumy region, where battles rage. Russians, who control a significant number of roads, likely agreed with the hope that city defenders would use this opportunity to escape. However, this does not happen. Meanwhile, invading force also starts suffering more and more every day. The logistics of the Russian grouping in Chernihiv and Kyiv regions heavily depends on convoys that go through the northern part of the Sumy region and 2 roads around Konotop. Taking into account that neither Konotop nor Rovny is fully captured, this creates numerous opportunities for ambushes. The 4th Tank Division is still unable to take Ochtyrka and Lebedin. Despite heavy destruction inside cities, the defenders of both towns from the 81st and 93rd Brigades continue to bleed down the Russian division by constantly destroying armor sent into assaults. Despite a lower advance rate, Russians continue to lose vehicles constantly. On March 10th, near Lebedin, territorial defense forces find 3 abandoned T-80s stuck in the mud. This usually happens when Russians try to avoid ambushes on roads and develop new routes for advance. On the next day, not far from here, Russians also abandoned 3 intact T-72s, this time on the road to Vyshkin, as well as 2 T-80s. The majority of losses are attributed to the 4th Tank Division. In many areas, Ukrainian forces start reversing Russian gains. The 93rd Mechanized Brigade advances towards Trostyanets with the support of the 91st Engineering Regiment that established a pontoon bridge across the Vorskla River. On March 17th, near the village of Bilka, the brigade encounters a large Russian supply column delivering provisions from Trostyanets to a farm serving as another base for the Russian 4th Tank Division. Over a dozen of tanks and numerous supply trucks are positioned in open areas without any attempt at concealment, while farm buildings, repurposed as barracks, stand as grim reminders of their executed owners. Using reconnaissance drones, Ukrainian forces direct the fire of recently captured Russian T-80 BVM tank, acquired during earlier operations in Kharkiv region. Guided by the drones, the T-80 accurately fires high explosive shells from 8 kilometers away, striking Russian tanks and damaging the vehicles positioned at the farm. A few Russian tanks manage to escape, but many others are destroyed. Ukrainian artillery and tanks then target the supply column parked on the road, hitting a truck loaded with ammunition with an accurate shot. This triggers an enormous explosion that engulfs the surrounding vehicles and their crews, destroying among others the only existing Russian T-80 OM-2 experimental prototype tank equipped with an active protection system. Over the next few days, Ukrainian forces destroyed 6 tanks, 25 trucks, an infantry fighting vehicle, and a self-propelled howitzer only in the Vilka area. Additionally, 35 Russian soldiers surrender. By March 21st, after assessing that the Russian forces are sufficiently weakened by grueling combat, the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, supported by auxiliary forces, launches a full-fledged offensive to recapture Trostyanets. This strategic move aims to reopen a critical road to Sumy and remove the threat to Ohtyrka and Labadin. Soldiers of the 93rd Brigade rely on the assistance of local volunteers who provide vital knowledge of the terrain and roads, while reconnaissance drones play a key role in directing their movements. Advancing from 3 directions, the brigade secures footholds in Vilka, Stanova and Luchka before pressing further. By March 24th, Ukrainian forces enter western part of Trostyanets, clashing with the 4th Tank Division. This wrecked unit, already suffering losses of at least 70 pieces of equipment and 3 senior officers, struggles to withstand the fierce Ukrainian assault. Some attacks on the division's positions look more like bold raids, as Russians fail to maintain the cohesive defensive line. Some Russian special operations units resist doggedly, but the fate of Trostyanets was already decided. Recognizing their inability to hold the city, Russian forces retreat under the cover of the night. On March 26th, the 93rd Brigade officially liberates Trostyanets, now littered with charred remains of the Russian armor. Without pause, the brigade advances into Boromlya, eliminating the threat from the Russian 1st Tank Army in the southern Sumy region. This decisive defeat, along with failures to capture Chernihiv and successful Ukrainian counterattacks near Kyiv, underscores the crumbling state of the Russian forces in northern Ukraine. Eventually, in an attempt to prevent catastrophic collapse, the Russian command announces the withdrawal of its forces from the Chernihiv, Sumy and Kyiv regions on March 29th, framing the retreat as a gesture of goodwill. The Sumy region, much like Chernihiv, became a formidable shield that delayed and weakened the invasion force, aimed at the eastern flank of the Ukraine's capital. Most importantly, 1st Guards Tank Army was forced to abandon its primary objective of advancing towards Kyiv due to the grueling resistance encountered in Sumy. While some argue that only half of the army's strength was committed to the Sumy offensive, the other half focusing on Kharkiv, Ukrainian forces faced way more disadvantages. The 93rd and 58th Brigades, the key Ukrainian regular army units in the region, had to split their efforts between defending Sumy and other critical fronts, including Kharkiv and Chernihiv as well. Despite this, the gaps in defenses were swiftly filled by volunteers and local partisans, who from the earliest days of the invasion choose not a white but blue and yellow flag. The relentless pressure applied by territorial defense forces and locals on adversary supply lines ultimately caused attrition in the Russian forces storming Kyiv. This allowed Kyiv's defenders alongside other regular army units like the 93rd Mechanized Brigade to launch counterattacks that systematically dismantled Russian positions in the northern Ukraine. The clashes between the 93rd Mechanized Brigade and the elite 4th Tank Division deserve special mention, as never before had such a prestigious Russian unit suffered such devastating losses. Their retreat from Trostyanets is sometimes referred to as one of the largest tank battles during the full-scale Russian invasion. However, rather than a coordinated battle, it was a chaotic collapse. Russian forces had already depleted themselves in costly assaults on Ohtyrka and Labadin, leaving them undermanned and under-equipped when the Ukrainian offensive began. The loss of Trostyanets not only opened the way for breakthrough towards Sumy from the south, but also played a major role in the Russian decision to withdraw from the northern Ukraine entirely. For both the failure to take Sumy and Kharkiv and the humiliating retreat from Trostyanets, Lieutenant General Sergei Kysel, commander of the 1st Guards Tank Army, was relieved of his position. Ironically, in an effort to ensure Kysel would not mismanage another section of the front line, he was reassigned far from Ukraine, to Syria. In November 2023, he was officially appointed commander of the operational grouping of Russian armed forces in Syria, tasked with supporting the pro-Russian Assad regime. Exactly a year later, in November 2024, the Syrian opposition launched its offensive. Kisel's unique military aptitude was once again evident, as the Assad government, heavily reliant on Russian forces, collapsed within days. In the Sumy region alone, photographic evidence shows that the Russians lost at least 351 pieces of equipment. Remarkably, over half of these, 183 pieces, were captured in good working condition and turned against their former owners. This incredible achievement was made possible by the tireless efforts of local volunteers and territorial defense forces, who either destroyed, abandoned Russian vehicles, or in many cases managed to evacuate them through gaps in the front lines. In contrast, Ukrainian losses in the region were minimal, with photographic evidence recording only about 20 vehicles lost. While these numbers likely underestimate the actual losses, it's reasonable to conclude that Ukrainians captured at least 10 times more equipment than they lost in the Sumy region. To put this into perspective, assuming the 93rd Mechanized Brigade had all 31 of its tanks operational in the tank battalion, in the course of the battle it managed to capture 66 additional T-80 tanks from the 4th Tank Division, tripling its armored strength. And this does not even account for the additional equipment the brigade seized during the successful operations in Kharkiv region. At the same time, the most elite Russian tank division lost over a third of its armored strength in the course of the first 3 weeks of the invasion. The human losses for both sides are rather unknown, but judging from the huge disparity in destroyed armored vehicles, it's fair to say that Russians suffered at least a few times more losses than Ukrainians. At the same time, huge damage was done to cities like Ochtyrka and Trostyanets, with most of the other towns in the Sumy region suffering less destruction due to the absence of active fighting and artillery use. As we mentioned, many Russian columns were destroyed in fields and forests by infantry ambushes, so the scale of destruction is way lower than, for example, in besieged Chernihiv. Despite that, Russian artillery and missile strikes across the region took the lives of over 200 civilians. These 40 days of resistance forever enshrined the Sumy region as a land of partisans in modern Ukrainian history. While the full-scale invasion initially created a wedge between Sumy and Konotop, it failed to divide Ukrainians themselves. Acting as united front, the civilians and the few armed forces brigades in the area achieved the unthinkable, halting and routing one of the Russia's most elite armies, thereby saving Kyiv and central Ukraine from the driving force of the Russian blitzkrieg.